So Peter, could you explain for 38 Degrees members what led you to decide to speak out about your resignation from the Daily Telegraph today?
The current management of the Telegraph are merging advertising and editorial considerations. And some of the news coverage seems to me to be shaped by advertisers or sponsors, or the needs anyway of the advertising department and their quest for profit. It came to a head last week when the Telegraph coverage of the HSBC story in Switzerland was just minimal. It was just about, there was nothing actually on page one, on day one of the story running. Tiny little bit on page 2, tiny little bit on page 3, and I felt here that there was a great issue now at stake about press freedom and also actually a duty, which mattered more to me in a funny way, to Telegraph readers to tell them what was going on.
And how do you think the influence between HSBC and the Telegraph has worked? How do you think they're bringing this pressure to bear?
There are big questions here to HSBC. I don't know. To the outsider, it looks as if they are using their advertising muscle, as it were, to punish papers which investigate them. I don't know if that's what they're doing, but they must explain. It's very important that HSBC explains why it made those two decisions. Last week's decision about The Guardian, the decision 3 years ago about the Telegraph.
And do you have a sense of what their agenda is? Does it just extend to stories about HSBC, or do you think it maybe had a bearing on some of the Telegraph's coverage of, say, questions of banking regulation more generally?
Yeah. I mean, I want to be extremely careful and only say what I know. And what I was able to detect was that after I did a careful study of the Telegraph's coverage of HSBC, and it became very tame after the advertising had been taken away. And it remained tame, and last week was a particularly obvious example.
And how prevalent do you think this kind of activity might be across the press?
This sort of merging of advertising and editorial, merging of two categories which ought to be distinct, is very troubling. And if that is the way news production is going to go, then we're all then really it's terrible. The integrity of journalism, that's what's so upsetting. The Telegraph was famous for its independent-minded news coverage, the accuracy of its reporting. Always said, like any old hand in Fleet Street, the Telegraph's reporting was always completely straight. Its editorials and leaders were pro-Tory normally, although it was always independent of the government, but it was a voice of conservative-minded people. But the news reporting was always famously straight. And if that's going to go away, and news is going to be a cooperative production between powerful corporate interests and willing accomplices in newspapers, then it's going to depart altogether from what we expect of honest reporting.
So you're speaking truth to power by speaking out in this way, which is something that 38 Degrees members really respect, and something lots of them have been asking me to ask you is how can we, ordinary readers of the news, help support whistleblowers like you and help stand up for an independent, objective press in the face of these kind of corporate pressures?
Well, I think you can make your views known. I think it's actually it's unfortunate, because you ought to be able, and this is what I feel personally, I'm very committed to the Telegraph. I love the Telegraph. I was incredibly proud when I went there. And readers should not be asked to effectively make judgments all the way through as they read news stories about how has this come about. They ought to be able to believe that to have a fair amount of trust that what they're being told is true and fair and properly based on sound editorial judgment.
I think if you think, say, that it's worth people who read the Telegraph writing a letter to the owners.
Look, I would love people who read the Telegraph to write letters to the Barclay brothers, demanding an explanation. I would hate them to leave the Telegraph. I mean, I still think it's a wonderful paper, but they must be given an explanation about what has been going on and an assurance it's not going to go on. And I think actually that means an independent person to come in and just look very hard and carefully at the relations between advertisers and editorial. And if they don't do that, I really think that at some point, Telegraph leaders are entitled to walk away, but it has not reached that moment yet. But because the Telegraph must show that it is a straight paper.
And you talked earlier about the level of trust that someone should be able to feel when they're reading news coverage in a newspaper like the Telegraph. Do you feel readers can feel that level of trust right now?
How can you trust the reporting of a paper which seems to make news judgments which are affected by advertising? You can't. It's outrageous, and it's a complete betrayal